Good evening, folks. I'm Arran Topalian, and welcome back to another episode of Game Design Live. For any newcomers, GDL offers you live interactive design deconstructions of a video game as it's played by a game designer, where we analyze a game's design as it's played and try to understand why certain design decisions were made. So if you're into game design in general or into a certain game and want to understand it better on a design level, this is the place to be. And tonight we are going to be looking at a deep dive on F.I.S.T, Forged in Shadow Torch. I picked it up a few weeks back now, and went through onto finishing it, which is rare for me. And I took that as a sign that maybe I should do a deep dive on it. It does some interesting things. It obviously takes a fair amount of inspiration, I would say, from games like Hollow Knight. But we're going to dive right in. Tonight we're going to be looking at a save file, a completed save file from when I finished the game. But to start us off, we're going to be looking at just the original kind of a fresh save, as I think it will give you kind of a better sense of what the game is like and what it has to offer. And it just has a really cool opening cutscene, which I want to show you guys. So I think we just go ahead and get started. Oh, that's the options menu. That's what that is. Cool. We can just use this one here. Doesn't matter.
I will not let this power fall into the wrong hands. Especially not yours. Traitor! I'll never let the Legion have the spark.
Happy birthday, Ray! Want to have a drink together?
Cool. So we're not going to go through all this dialogue just at the start, but I wanted to show you the opening, and it sells the game really well, I think, and presents sort of the story world this whole thing takes place in. Unfortunately, you don't get to play at any point the protagonist that we just saw, which is a shame because she seems badass. I'm really hoping in the second game, if they do a second game, you do get to. And they pull a little bit of a Hollow Knight with... is it Silksong? Yeah, Silksong. But yeah, so we're going to go ahead and quit out of this now, now that we've sort of set the tone for what to expect with the game. He says I'm unable to reach the pause menu. I'm just going to skip through all of this real quick. And nope, it's still not going to let me out. Oh, I can get out now. I can skip. Cool. And there's still more. So let's talk about the game a little bit at a high level before we manage to quit this whole thing. So F.I.S.T is as the way the developers describe it, is a diesel punk Metroidvania style game developed by Shanghai T Games Network Technology Limited, which is a mouthful, and published by Bilibili, which was released last October. For anyone unfamiliar with the term as well, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, and this is obviously a channel for everyone, Metroidvania is a term used used to refer to a certain type of game that typically features a couple of sort of similar aspects. Namely, it's a side scroller, so it's sort of 2D or 2.5D. You can go left, right, up, and down, but it's not fully 3D. Although saying that a 3D game can have Metroidvania elements, but a sort of true Metroidvania experience is typically side-scrolling. An interconnected game world as well, and a very big emphasis on returning to previously inaccessible areas of the world as you progress. So I'm going to skip through this dialogue real quick so we can try and get to the pause menu. The term is... I'm going to try and say this word. I only learned it today. Portmanteau. It's a portmanteau of the Metroid and Castlevania games, which basically means sort of a fusion of their titles. Hence the term Metroidvania. And yeah, mainly since games in this genre sort of typically borrow, to one extent or another, design aspects from each of them. Okay, this is kind of a cool cutscene, so we should just let this play out. Cool. So you play as this main character, Rayton, who is essentially Solid Snake, but as a rabbit, which is a high sell. And the premise is that there is an antagonist who has kidnapped your friend, and you are basically tasked with getting them back and saving them. And in the meantime, you kind of learn more about the world as you go, and you progress and pick up the combat and so on. Obviously, you can check out the summary and synopsis anywhere online if you're interested in finding out a bit more about the game. So the sort of main areas that I'd like to hone in on during this episode, we've only got about 55 minutes now, is F.I.S.T combat, but we'll also be touching on its progression, some of its UX, and its world design, as well as some other bits and pieces if we have time. So for the most part, we're going to be using the save file that I've already got prepared. This is one I made earlier. We're going to return to the title menu and bring up the save file, which is this one. Yeah, so mainly so we can just check out more areas of the game, because I know in previous episodes we've struggled to kind of get through to things that we wanted to see. But before that, we should also mention just that, the imagination behind F.I.S.T, I think, is particularly incredible. I do want to call out, particularly with regards to their visual style and their story world. To me, it kind of felt like playing the offspring of Redwall meets Final Fantasy VII's Midgar. But yeah, so the game starts off in a place called Torch City. We're going to fast travel there now if we can. You're going to be seeing a lot of different bits and pieces about the game as I get us there, which we are hopefully going to cover, namely things like the map and how the game supports movement. This is very near the end of the game. Let's just jump down here for a sec, because there is a fast travel point around somewhere. Further down, one more. And we're just going to jump over here. Oh, look at me remembering the controls. Cool. And we're going to jump to Joffre Street. Seems like a good place to start. So yeah, the game takes place in, or namely starts in Torch City. And as I said before, I think it's safe to say that F.I.S.T's visuals and overall art style, when it comes to its world design, are immediately striking. There's just something kind of an unexplainable but understandable cool factor to a game, I think, that, lets you play as a Solid Snake-esque badass rabbit who uses a giant mechanical arm as a weapon. It's not every day you get to occupy that particular pair of shoes. The game world is divided up into different zones, which you gradually progress through as you progress through the story, which is fairly in keeping with a Metroidvania, and is also, I would say, fairly in keeping with other sort of Metroidvania-style conventions. So it's a side-scroller. There are enemies to fight. You have abilities to unlock, which grant access to previously inaccessible areas of the game, and it has an interconnected game world. So here we have, for example, the map to give you a sense of that interconnected world. You can see here they've used colors to help differentiate between the different zones. And if I zoom right out, you get a sense of the world in full. Not quite as sort of, I'd say, large or large is a fine enough word for it. Large as Hollow Knight for as a reference, which is something we're going to be doing throughout the episode. They do, I think, draw on Hollow Knight a fair amount. But this is the overall game world. But I would say that its own flourishes to the game, or rather to the genre, the Metroidvania genre, based on my experience with it, were namely its focus on button combo-based combat, and its visual style and atmosphere and the way they sort of create their world. And we're going to talk about these things first and foremost, as I think they're the most pressing. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the combat. So F.I.S.T. involves 3 different weapons, which eventually you unlock all 3. You start off with just the fist, which is this thing right here, and then eventually you unlock the drill. Whoops, I'm going to talk to Gat, first of all, accidentally. So you've got the drill, you've got 2 main attack buttons. So you've got a light attack, I think they call it, and a heavy attack, I think they call it again. Let's just check out the controls to see exactly what they call it, just out of interest. Yeah, so light attack and heavy attack, and then you have a special action, which is something separate entirely. But that's what the game is predicated on. We should also check out an upgrade station, just so we can have a look at the button combo side of things. But as with games like Devil May Cry, the combat allows players to switch between weapons throughout the combat. So, you can be doing a combo with this weapon and then switch into the drill, which we're going to have a look at in a bit more detail when we go into training in just a second to showcase the combat in action. But yeah, if we have a look at this guy right here, there we go. We will see what we're talking about. So this is the sort of progression tech tree of the game, where you've got a bunch of different things you can unlock. You can see here that I've unlocked most of them, which is good because we're going to be talking about them. And if we jump into them, you can see how they work. So, there are different things to do here. Hold down square to build up power, up and square to knock an enemy into the air. Then you've got more sort of button combo-y things, such as here, for example. So square, 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 triangle, triangle in sequence, and then you pull off a super cool move. So this thing here, that's another combo. So this is sort of the basic sort of foundations that the combat is predicated on. So let's just jump into the training for a second. We could probably try and find a fight, but it's also fine just to do this. So yeah, there's a bunch of different NPCs that you'll meet throughout the game as you go through it. This is, I think, your sort of training master, your sort of sensei, basically, who sort of trains you up to be the fighting machine that you are. I'm not going to go into too much detail in the story, just in case you want to play it yourselves. Let's just jump into a little bit of training, and we'll jump into some advanced training, since it's not ticked, so might as well do that. So, yeah, so for example, here we have here, and that's kind of a sense of how the combat looks and feels to operate. So you've got a lot of haptic feedback in the controller, a fair amount of screen shake. Let's just do that again. And as you can see, the enemy offers a fair amount of feedback, visual feedback, when it's attacked. So you know exactly what enemy you've hit, where it sort of has this sort of orange flash. And you've got those health bar chunks that we've seen in previous episodes for other games. As I mentioned, though, you can switch between weapons throughout combos. So, we can start off with something like this, where you're like, so, and then, whoops. Let's just try that again. Nope. There we go, okay. Something like that. Let's give it a little go, hang on. Push this guy back over here. There we go. There's a little bit of a combo there for you to get a sense of what we're talking about. So in that example just there, I uppercutted the guy with the fist, and then after that managed to keep him up in the air a little bit longer with this, I think they just call it the whip. So why have these been included as part of the game's design is the first question, and what are the ramifications of that inclusion? So as with, when I say that as well, what I'm referring to is the button combos and the weapon switching. So as with aiming in first-person shooters that rely on hand-eye coordination, or dodging in Hollow Knight that relies on things like response times or reflex times, button combos are another form of mastery, which is an aspect of game design that we talk about frequently in GDL, and that in turn relies on memory. So this type of mastery is most often seen in fighting games, such as Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat, where each champion in these kind of games has a list of moves they can do that can be triggered by entering the correct sequence of buttons, right? And this means that in order to truly master the game's combat, players need to memorize what those combinations are, as well as grok the optimal gameplay situations to use them in. So by allowing the player to have different weapons and switch between them during combat, this typically improves the player's ability to indulge in expressive play and also raises the mastery ceiling considerably, right? Instead of just having one set of moves to memorize, you've got potentially several, which players can learn how to best synergize and can also learn how best to use. So for example, we had the combo we did a second ago, but another one would be, I can hit the enemy up in the air with weapon A and then keep them up in the air with weapon B. I would say as well that F.I.S.T does something quite cool where, in order to limit the amount of information that players have to remember, F.I.S.T gives every weapon pretty much the same button combo inputs. So if we jump out into this little room here, and I can show you... Oh no, we had to finish off this trial, right? Can I just quit it? Okay, no we can't. I'm going to have to kill this thing. Or can I talk to him to end the training?
What is it?
Oh cool, yeah we can't do that.
Very well.
That was handy. Cheers, mate. So yeah, if we have a look at this again, for example, we'll see that all of the weapons essentially use the same combos. So here we have hold down square to build up power, and I think that's pretty much the same in other places. Yeah, so the combo buttons are also pretty much the same. So square, 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 triangle is pretty much the same as the square, 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 triangle, triangle we saw for the F.I.S.T. So they are fairly similar. You don't get too much into the weeds in terms of, mixing up the button combos. So it's triangle, square, triangle, but then for another weapon, it's square, square, triangle, square, or whatever, right? So a lot of it is kept fairly simple, where it's either relying on a direction with the stick and a button, or the same combos across the weapons. And the reason this would probably be done is to try and retain a bit more approachability for the game, right? Whenever you played a fighting game yourselves, if you ever have played a fighting game yourselves, you tend to find that the first thing you struggle with is just remembering all the moves, right? So to help with that, you can simplify the inputs and also make them similar across all the different things that you offer the player in terms of tools or weapons or characters, whatever it is that the game is offering. Now, if you're the type of person who has a good memory, especially short-term, games that rely on memory as its primary approach to mastery, they're not a problem. But if you're like me, despite the relatively short list of combos, and simple combos at that, you're probably the type who ends up relying on one or two moves of a singular thing, whether it's a character or a weapon. And that's exactly what ended up happening to me in F.I.S.T. For pretty much the entire game, I used only the first weapon, which is the F.I.S.T, this guy right here. And I relied on, I think, 2 of its moves to get the job done, which, truth be told, did get the job done. And those 2 moves were this guy right here, and this one right here. And that was pretty much all I used throughout the experience. Now, obviously, I have no way of knowing whether or not this was the developer's intention, but assuming it wasn't, and their aim was to try and encourage players to make use of the 2 additional weapons the game offers, I feel like the design of the weapons themselves could have communicated their combat purposes a bit more clearly and obviously, or possessed even just, clear combat purposes in general. So what do we mean by combat purposes? So whenever your player is faced with a problem to solve in the game that you're offering them, it's important that they understand 2 things in particular. Obviously depending on the game, but by and large. The first is what tools they have available to solve that problem, like understanding very clearly what tools they have at their disposal to solve the problem in front of them. And the second thing is the strengths and weaknesses, understanding the strengths and weaknesses of those tools. And that allows your player to make what we call an informed decision. So to use a really basic example, let's say that you have, to use a totally different game as an example as well, so let's say you have a player in a shooting game, and they're faced with a large group of relatively weak-looking enemies, and they're offered 2 weapons, right, to deal with that problem. They're offered a rocket launcher, or they're offered a sniper rifle. And for argument's sake, let's just say that both of these weapons have little sort of mini tutorial videos or something in action too, so players can see what they do. odds are the player will see the destructive force of the rocket launcher and choose it over the sniper rifle because its combat purpose. Whoops. Okay, we're going to have to deal with this in a second. Its combat purpose, based on its function versus the design of the problem, is fairly clear. In F.I.S.T, however, there was rarely a combat problem that I felt couldn't be solved with the original weapon, nor a scenario where I felt smart for spotting an opportunity to make the most of a different weapon. And this might have also been down to the relatively similar design of its enemies. Weapons and enemy design typically being two sides of the same coin. So by and large, you have your melee enemies and your ranged enemies, and they pretty much function the exact same. Like even just looking at these guys here, you can see that they're essentially doing the same thing. We have these overhead swipes. They look a little bit different, and I think their attack patterns vary ever so slightly, but by and large, they're pretty much the same, which means that the combat problem is usually fairly similar, and as a result, if the combat problem is similar, it means that you're probably just going to use the same tool over and over again because you don't rely on any other kind of tool to solve that issue, right? Like, for example, if you had, let's say, for example, we had a bunch of really weak enemies, again, to use that example, and we have this weapon, which is the whip, which, as you can see, is capable of going through multiple enemies at the same time. Let's just deal with this, actually. That wasn't actually too bad. But for my part, typically I relied on just the F.I.S.T because, like I say, I didn't quite garner what the purposes, the combat purposes of, or combat intention of the weapons were. Given its style of combat as well, it would have been particularly nice to have had a combo counter in F.I.S.T as well. Like, this is basically a number that you see in some games, somewhere on the screen, on the UI, on the HUD usually, that represents how many times you've landed hits on enemies without taking damage yourself, and usually feels quite satisfying. I'm just going to check this out here. So let's just yeah. So we've talked a little bit now about the button comboing and the weapon switching, so let's talk a bit about the rules of engagement in F.I.S.T. So whenever you're designing a game's combat experience, there's several kind of super important elements to think about, which I like to call the rules of engagement in a game. So it's basically, what this means is the rules of your game's combat. And it's quite kind of like niggly things that sort of are concerned with the rules of engagement. So this is things like how your enemies telegraph their attack. By that I mean, the animations or the visuals or the VFX that are used in telling players, hey, this enemy is about to attack. There's also things like attack cancellation, which is to what extent players can cancel their own commands. So, if I press a button and press another button, am I able to escape that action before it's played out? So, for example, here, if I punch and press dodge, you can see the punch has to play out before the dodge actually gets to execute. I can't cancel the attack mid-punch. I have to wait for the punch to actually play out before the dodge occurs, which isn't always the case in games, combat games in particular. You've also got attack interruption. So attack interruption is when or how a player's attacks will be interrupted by an enemy. So, for example here, if we fight this guy and we're punching, you see here these bullets this guy is firing don't seem to be doing anything to me whatsoever. Like, I'm still able to attack through them, except for the last bullet, which is a bit weird, and is exactly what I'm going to talk about in a second. Whereas here, if I'm going to let this guy hit me, yeah, he just flat out cancels my attack. So the rules are a little bit strange around, when exactly your attacks will be cancelled in F.I.S.T. There are some times where it doesn't, and sometimes where it is, and it's not entirely clear why that is or whatever else. You've then got, just to continue on with the rules of engagement and what those are, you've then got enemy flinching. So enemy flinching is when and how a player's attacks will interrupt enemy attacks. So it's the opposite of attack interruption. So, for example, you've got this guy here that's coming at me with his sword. Let's wait for him to attack. And there we go. You can see that as I punched him, he had his attack cancelled, and we stopped him from attacking. Let's do it with the gun. Oh, yeah. So that's what enemy flinching is. You've also got what are called enemy silhouettes, which refers to the visual design of your enemies. So we've talked about a little bit this in the past before, enemy silhouettes. But enemy silhouettes basically means the enemy's profile, which helps players quickly identify what they're fighting or what the threat is. So, for example, the reason this is referred to as silhouettes is imagine that these enemies, for example, were just pictures, just 2D pictures. Now imagine that they're completely blacked out, so it's just hard black silhouettes of their outline. And then you ask a player or a tester to kind of identify which enemies are which based on just the silhouettes, without any use of color or any kind of like more detailed visuals. It's purely on silhouette alone. And this is typically used as a kind of a way to ensure that players can very quickly. Overwatch does a great job of this. For example, if you look at all the Overwatch heroes, they go to great lengths to ensure their silhouettes are all very distinct, so that players understand when they're confronted with another player what champion they're using, so they can again make an informed decision about how to behave in that fight. And then last but not least, you've got input queuing. So input queuing is how long the game remembers a player's button press whilst they're in the midst of another command. So by that, I mean, let's try and test that out. If I throw a couple of punches, then hit dodge straight after, and you see here I just dodge straight away, so the game just knows, yeah, okay, you press that button. If, however, I run over here, it's a bit difficult with two guys. There we go, that's better. So if we run over here for a sec. Okay, it's a little bit difficult to actually showcase when people are watching as opposed to actually playing it. Oh, that was close. Cool. So yeah, those are the sort of key 6 elements regarding the rules of engagement in a game, or particularly in a game's design. And the decisions made around your game's rules of engagement will often play a very major role in the overall feel of your game's combat. Oh, just going to jump over here. And I did find throughout F.I.S.T. that, by and large, the way that you need or want to fight in F.I.S.T. isn't always entirely supported by its rules of engagement. Obviously, we've only seen a couple of like smaller fights so far. If I can find a larger fight, that would be great. Let's actually just go over here and see if we can find one. But a lot of the time, you are confronted with a fair few enemies in F.I.S.T., and it feels like you want to sort of be quicker than you actually are. They also make some interesting decisions around what is offered to players straight out the box versus what they have to go ahead and unlock. Oh boy. Let's just head down here. Okay, we are way off the beaten path now. I'm just going to keep moving and hope that I live through this. Oh gosh, I don't even know where I'm going. Are we anywhere near a save point or something? No, okay, great. That's alright, we'll be fine. So one of the things that I do want to call out with regard to its combat as well that I found quite interesting was the fact that, as you can see here, there's no representation of enemy health whatsoever. There are no enemy health bars. There is no sort of like gradual degrading of an enemy's visuals. There's no kind of crazing on the enemy or anything to indicate how close they are to death. There's nothing whatsoever. The only thing that can happen is when they're quite close to death is that they sort of flash orangey, and that's an indication that you can use an execution move, which we've seen once already, but we'll see if we can replicate. We are going to quit here because I've gone way down somewhere. I don't know where I am right now, so let's just quit out and reload that save file. It'll be easier to get back to the main hub. We're also going to talk about the fast travel as well. Oh no, is it saved us here? It's fine, we can head back. So yeah, enemy health bars. So this feels like quite an intentional omission from their design, which I would guess is a better way of ensuring that players are more focused on the enemies themselves and their attack cues, or potentially to make combat less cluttered, especially when there's lots of enemies on the screen at the same time. So we've talked a bit about combat. We're now going to talk a little bit about the exploration of the game, what the game does in terms of its exploration factor, which is a big part of any Metroidvania. So, like we said at the start, it's a side-scrolling game with an interconnected game world to explore, which is divided up into different, what we call biomes. And biomes in games essentially just mean different zones, which typically feature distinct visual characteristics, but can also include different enemies or gameplay experiences, which sort of feed off of their what's the word I'm looking for? Their the characteristics of their region, I guess you'd say. So, for example, if you're in the volcano biome and, you see a big volcano at the center of that biome, maybe you expect to see sort of like, falling debris from the sky as the volcano explodes or things like that. And the same thing goes for enemies. Enemies often can be kind of like contextually supported by the biome that they exist in. So in addition to its biomes, there's a couple of other aspects of F.I.S.T design regarding exploration that we're going to be touching on. Namely its map, its fast travel, and its approach to player movement. So yeah, let's talk about biomes first and foremost before we talk about anything else. So the game starts you off in the city biome. This is the one that we're in right now, which for my part was easily the most enjoyable purely because of how visually stunning it often is. Even just looking at this, for example, like this is a great example of what it offers. It typically offers incredibly detailed 2.5D backdrops that add a real sense of depth to the biome. Like you can see like almost right back here into the back alley just standing here. So it really makes you feel like you're in somewhere really kind of dense and full. I'd actually, truth be told, have been quite happy if the game had just stuck to Torch City for the entire game and allowed me to just see more of it. I really kind of just fell in love with Torch City from the get-go. However, eventually you're kind of like ushered off into other biomes, which we're going to talk about a bit more. But yeah, so biomes in game design are handy for a couple of reasons. So they can provide your game with greater visual variety and color palettes. Color palettes being, sort of the core colors of that environment. And variety in any kind of like interactive experience is super important, be it interactive or visual, and biomes do exactly that. So in your forest biome, if you were to have a forest biome, maybe you're looking at greens and browns and maybe a little bit of blue for water. Whereas in a city biome, maybe you're looking at, depending on the style of city, but in this example, maybe some grays, some more browns, some neon in there, some neon pinks and some neon greens and whatever else. They can also, like I said before, offer contextual support for the design. Just to call this out, and look at this is incredible. You've even got like moving trams. It's incredible. So they can also offer contextual support for the design of different enemies in your game. So using the volcano example again, you have fire-covered enemies in the volcano biome, etc. And they can also quickly convey things to the player thanks to pre-existing mental models, namely in terms of what's expected from them or what they can expect to be doing in that biome. And as you progress further into the game, you're taken to sort of new biomes, including there was an underwater cavern, which I think is this one right here. You had the ancient temple. There was a sort of diesel punk forgotten factory. The water temple is definitely one that I want to touch on a little bit more. I don't know if fast travel is really an option because it's a little bit finicky. I tend to have a bit of an issue with water biomes in general in game design. And in F.I.S.T. in particular, I really did. F.I.S.T. does a pretty incredible job when it comes to movement, and we're going to talk about that a bit more in a bit more detail soon. But it does some clever things to make movement feel quite satisfying, and their platforming, for the most part, was very satisfying. However, with the water biome, even just looking at it, you can kind of get a sense of what's going on here. Like this thing, for example, you pretty much swim through the entire thing. I don't mean that sort of metaphorically. I mean literally, you swim through most of it. So for the most part, you're just kind of like moving the stick and avoiding enemies, but there's no platforming involved. And it felt a little bit kind of like, to sort of give the player a very large portion of the game, essentially sort of a third of its experience, without arguably some of its best bits, which was, like I say, its platforming and its sort of fundamental core movement, to then kind of find yourself in this location where none of that is required, none of those skills are required. Felt a little bit strange. But water biomes are quite a standard thing to expect. You see them quite often when biomes are concerned. But yeah. We're also going to talk about the fast travel a little bit next, which I've touched on a couple of times. So let's just run over here to a fast travel station. So F.I.S.T. offers two means of fast travel. They have two systems doing the same job. So first and foremost, you have these sort of hamster ball mechanisms. Let's jump up here for a second. So yeah, this thing. I couldn't think of any other way of describing it. So this is the first kind of way you can fast travel in the city. So if I hit teleport, and you're given a bunch of different places that you can jump to. But If you're a big fan of fast travel systems and one just isn't enough in your game, then you can also, I'm just going to get a sense of where that is. I think it's this one to talk about what I want to talk about. I think. Let's give it a go and see if it's right. Okay. Major question is, did he get it right? He did. Cool. So yeah, it has two systems. It has this sort of hamster ball system, but then it also has this subway system. And the subway system is completely separate from the hamster ball. I'm just gonna that is now its official name from the hamster ball system. So if we look at the subway, you can see here there's a lot less positions to fast travel around. And what's more, you're not shown the fast travel points for the hamster ball system, so they're completely disconnected. So if you want to kind of figure out where to go via these systems, you kind of have to figure it out entirely in the game map. So if you look at the game map here, you'll see that you can see here's the hamster ball icon, and then there's the train icon. So if you want to sort of figure out where to go quickly, you almost sort of have to plan your route in advance. Like, if it wasn't bad enough in real life, you have to do it in the game as well. So yeah, if you want to figure out where to go quickly, you kind of have to do it via the map and then sort of feel it out by jumping over to the fast travel system, bringing up their map and kind of guesstimating which one is next to the hamster ball machine that you need to take to get to another location. From a deconstruction standpoint, it's difficult to say what the rationale might have been for including the two different systems. It does make fast travel far more pernickety than maybe it needs to be. It does, although it does have that sort of that real life factor of having to almost kind of like plan a journey. I'm not sure if that's something that people would necessarily want coming into a game like this, as opposed to just understanding where they are and where they want to go. But it definitely does provide that sort of, like I say, plan your own journey type experience. So yeah, two fast travel systems, not just one. And then the map, since we're looking at it, is a good place to go to next. So speaking of these zones, the game world is divided into, as in Hollow Knight, which I suspect it drew a lot on for inspiration. Each zone in F.I.S.T's world is given its own unique color on the game map, as you can see here. So, you know, we're not given names of anywhere. Oh, we are actually in the top. So we're given prison there. You can see at the top there on the UI that it tells you what you're looking at when you're looking on the map. Old Town, Power Station, Central Station, and so on. And as I mentioned, they're all different colors as well. So if you compare this to an older Metroidvania map, such as, let's say, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, you'll notice that these kinds of maps used to, by and large, rock just one singular color. And the problem with that was that it doesn't make it very easy for a player to understand or identify where one zone ends and another begins, which in turn can make navigating the world and having a clearer sense of your location within it considerably more difficult. So that's something to bear in mind. That being said, I did miss having access to one of Hollow Knight's, in my opinion, ingenious additions, which was the inclusion of map markers. So in Hollow Knight, you're given these things called map markers, which you can also earn more of and are very coveted, which are essentially tokens of different shapes and colors that you could place a limited number of on your world map. And like I say, you could also find and buy more of them. And you could use these markers as a way to sort of develop your own language of reminders. So for example, you know, if you had a sort of round purple token, you could imagine that that means places that you can't get to yet because you obviously don't have the ability required to get there. And it meant then that you didn't have to sort of try and remember why a certain area of your map wasn't filled in, which saves you a potentially wasted trip. Whereas in F.I.S.T, like I say, there is no map markers whatsoever. So for example, here, you know, down in the bottom corner of the map here, we can see there's a bit of black that's overlaid over the map. And I have no idea why. Especially now, having not played it for a couple of weeks. But, you know, even here, for example, we can see again, there's obviously a place that I've just left. And as I played throughout the game, it led to a little bit of decentralization to actually go back to those locations or re-explore the world, because it could potentially be a huge waste of time just to get back there. And like I say, fast travel isn't the easiest. So it made things a little bit more difficult to actually understand why certain areas were blacked out like this. Whereas in, like I say, Hollow Knight with the map markers, you could keep a mental note of that far more easily. Cool. And the last thing I want to touch on a high level is the movement of F.I.S.T, as it does a couple of, I think, quite cool, clever things. So let's just jump back here and head back to Joffre Street, which is where it's at. If you're enjoying the content, by the way, then you can definitely check out other episodes either on the Twitch channel or on the YouTube channel, which is where I post all the older videos. You can find links to the YouTube channel on the Twitch channel itself. So far, we've done only one other deep dive so far, which is on Doom Eternal, which is a two-parter. So if you're interested in checking that out, by all means, please do. And if you're enjoying the content, as always, please do follow the channel. It would be hugely appreciated. So let's take a look at the movement next. So a big part of any Metroidvania game, in fact, a big part of any game in general, is movement. So how you're able to move around the game world, how the jump feels, and what new means of movement the game offers, if any, in order to offer increasingly compelling platforming challenges or combat mastery. So, for example, in Metroid, it was turning into a ball. In Symphony of the Night, it was turning into a bat, I think, or mist. Whereas in F.I.S.T, what it does, let's just see if we can find a wall. So yeah, as you can see here, you can double jump, and you also have this dash. So these are the two main aspects of F.I.S.T's movement. You start off the game with only being able to dash in one singular direction, which is straight ahead. However, eventually you unlock the ability to omni-dash, which is basically the ability to dash in any direction that you like by pushing that direction and pressing the dash button. You can also see, just to touch on a little bit of the game's UX, which I thought was quite a nice trick and very much appreciated, is that when your dash is recharged, your character flashes. You'll also notice that the timer for the dash is somewhat relying on you landing back on solid ground. So, you know, if we use the dash, instant recharge, whereas if you use the dash here, it took a bit longer to recharge and only recharged once our feet were back on the ground. But what F.I.S.T does that was quite cool and led to some really fun platforming experiences is that you can also wall jump. This is another aspect of F.I.S.T's movement, is that you can wall slide / wall jump. So let's just use this wall, perfect wall for demonstration purposes. But what's cool is that your dash recharges each time you wall slide. So let's just go ahead and give that a try. So if I dash, hit the wall, and then it recharges instantly. So this led to really cool kind of scenarios where, you know, you were able to kind of like zip between walls. It just opened up the gameplay far more in terms of platforming. It was a really nice welcome addition, I thought, that was a little bit fresh compared to sort of traditional Metroidvania experiences. I think as well the double jump is also refreshed, yeah. So, yeah, you're also able to do that. So not only can you double jump again, but also dash. And I think this was quite an interesting addition to its design. Let's just jump over here. Cool. So we've got 15 minutes left. We've talked through sort of two of the major aspects of the game. So I think now we'll have a chat around, you know, some of the minor aspects, and we'll call it some bits and pieces as we go. So we've seen a couple of the NPCs so far. We've seen, you know, you've seen a couple of characters here. I will say that the characterization of the game is pretty stellar. Like, I've met a couple of quite memorable characters along the way. They're all voice acted superbly. Rayton himself is acted particularly well. Let's just have a look at this guy here, for example, and order some noodles.
Famous in Torch City. How about a bowl?
Stunning. That's some good eating. Thank you, Mr. Raccoon Guy. Cool. So yeah, you meet a number of quite memorable, colorful characters throughout the game. And I would have particularly loved the opportunity to get to know them a little bit more. There's not really much of an opportunity for chatting with the NPCs in the game, nor is there any kind of incentive to deepen the relationships with the NPCs. They're fairly surface level. And I would say that for the most part, the F.I.S.T game world does feel a little bit surface level sometimes. For instance, you know, this stunning world of Torch City, which, like I say, you really want to go off and explore, and unfortunately don't get to do too much of. Is again kind of quite surface level, and ironically so, considering just how deep the whole thing looks. But you don't really get a chance to go off and kind of see any more of its districts or its back alleys or what other secrets it holds, which look like many just by standing here. And the attention to detail is particularly stunning. Like, you can see posters and signs and all sorts, really trying to sort of like bring the city to life. But there's no real sense of the history behind the world. When you play a game like Hollow Knight, you're walking through it, and the game world almost tells a story of what has come before, through the decoration and the various objects that are scattered throughout that give you a sense of things that have happened in the past. Whereas in Torch City, it's a bit of a shame in the sense that you don't quite get a same sense of the lore behind the world. And there is a little bit of lore. They do kind of expand the story world as you play, and it goes into a bit more about Brayton's backstory and also the antagonist and their relationship. But again, it's quite light. And considering how well they're voice acted, how well they're portrayed, how well they're characterized, it would have been great to just to be able to dive into that a little bit more and experience that a little bit more. But that could also just be me. Let's just jump over here. We also have the healing mechanic. So you probably spotted it a little bit before. It's this thing here. So if you pull the right trigger, you'll see there in the bottom left corner of the screen that we have this little flask with 4 segments. This is your carrot juice flask. Of course it is. And by drinking from that flask, you can refill your health, which proves to be vital throughout the game, as it is quite punishing. Boss fights in particular, for that matter. I'm not going to lie, the last boss fight was only something I could conquer because of a bug that I was extremely thankful for, where the boss just suddenly froze and stopped attacking, and it was a boss. I mean, honestly, folks, I have played through a lot of games, I've beaten a lot of bosses. That was far and away one of the most challenging boss fights I've ever had to go through. Like, having finished games like Dark Souls and Bloodborne and whatnot, like it was particularly grueling. But yeah, back to the point. So carrot juice, you press and hold the right trigger. What's interesting is that your health isn't awarded until the animation has finished, which proved to be quite frustrating during particularly heated fights where you just wanted to top up some health and felt like you almost had to kind of like break away from the action to find a safe spot, so you can see where the character flashes. That's where the health is awarded, and could prove to be quite frustrating from a developer standpoint. From a deconstruction standpoint, I guess it was to maybe try and place a greater emphasis on positioning, or to potentially try and make the game a little bit harder. Like we talked about, it is quite a challenging game at times, especially regarding its combat. Another aspect of the game that I felt I would have loved to have seen more of from F.I.S.T. is a few more optional challenges in the world. Again, going back to Hollow Knight, you have various aspects in that game, like you have arenas and optional challenges that you'll come across, and you can decide whether or not you want to engage in those, and you can leave them alone, or you can come back to them or power up a little bit or whatever else. And in F.I.S.T., I would have particularly loved to have seen, secret areas and places that offered that kind of experience. Maybe I just didn't find them. But I scoured the map a fair amount. There were a few places that I left untouched. There's also some sort of ancient door, which I now realized I'm never going to know what's behind, and it's going to drive me crazy. I might have to Google that. But anyway, that also would have been particularly fantastic to get a bit more from the game. You're also offered some cosmetic changes. So, there are collectibles that you can find throughout the game, and these can be used namely to unlock new cosmetics for your gear. So you can see here that each of the 3 different weapons that you can equip have different schematics for colors. They've even, as you can see there's a very clear hint to, or a little homage to Hollow Knight itself. And this is sort of the main sort of chase prize, I guess, other than the progression side of things, the core progression side of things, which I don't think we can look at here, but we can check out up here. We looked at before. Whoops. Let's just check up here. Oh, no, that's the wrong machine. I did find at times the iconography could be a little bit confusing. This one in particular, more often than not, I mistook for a train. So there were a number of times where I went hunting down one of these icons thinking that it was, where is it? This one right here in the middle. Even looking at the two of them side by side, they are maybe it's just me again, but maybe to me they felt kind of similar. So there were times where I hunted down a train station only to find an upgrade spot. But that's okay. So let's just head over here, back to the upgrade station. I love this in particular. So this door, we're going to talk about this door a little bit. You've seen this probably in other games where you have a door that has some sort of mechanism that has to run its course before the door actually opens. And sometimes that can be purely just a visual thing, because it matches the environment that it's part of a little bit more. But in my experience, more often than not, this is a clever way of disguising loading in the game. So, there's a mechanism that needs to run its course, but it also looks like it's part of the world, and it all feels very kind of contextual and appropriate. And of course, it's a door that has cogs and wheels and whatnot that have to operate before it opens. That just makes sense. But really what the developers are doing is that they're using this as a way of disguising the fact that they're loading assets while you wait for the door to open. And obviously, if a longer load is required, the cogs can turn for longer or as long as the developers need it to until the game's ready. So yeah, core progression-wise, we looked at this already, but we're going to talk about a bit more detail. So you've got two main currencies in the game. You have coins and you have data drive disks. So coins, this is the only thing as well that you spend money on in the game. This is the only thing really you can buy are these upgrades. So there's no things like, sort of maps to buy or anything like that, or tokens or whatever else, or new weapons. New weapons are offered entirely to the game, and everything else is purely all about this tech tree right here. So yeah, you have money, but you also, like I say, have the disk drive thingies, which is important because they sort of factor into the upgrade system. So sometimes you'll come across a move. This is a move we already purchased a while back. It cost 500 coins and one disk drive data disk, or whatever it's called. Let's just call it data disks for brevity's sake. And from a design standpoint, it was an interesting choice, to have these two commodities. I guess it sort of encouraged players to explore the world a little bit more. The data disks were only something you could earn by actually going out into the world and exploring it and finding these things. Every so often you'd be awarded one by the story as well. But by and large, you earn the majority of them by actually exploring the world. If players could just grind enemies to unlock all the moves, then really you're sort of decentivizing exploration of the world, because there's no real reason to go off and do that, right? So by locking their progression behind exploration, it was a clever way to kind of incentivize me to go off and do that, at least up to a certain point. There was something else that I wanted to talk about. That's what it was, looking at the upgrade system. We've got a couple minutes left. So as you can see, let's just check back that real quick. So as you can see here, these two branches are by and large fully unlocked. There's no padlock icons on it whatsoever. All the moves are available for purchase. On this branch, however, there's a couple that are still locked. The way that you unlock them, just in case anyone fancies playing this game themselves, the way you unlock them is by talking to your old mentor and entering training. And then after you do training for a certain weapon type, so you can see here that the F.I.S.T and the drill are both ticked. Those are the ones that didn't have any padlock icons. But the whip training is the only one that's unticked, and that's the only one also in the progression tree that had padlocked icons. So the way you unlock them is by doing the training. But
Ray,
at no point, at least as far as I saw, does the game actually tell you that that's how you unlock them. Even by highlighting over them in the progression tree, there's no sort of tooltip that says go and talk to so-and-so and do the training to unlock them. You can't even highlight them for that matter. So for a huge portion of the game, I played with a limited set of moves, and kind of figured that, eventually the story would just unlock those padlocked icons. And as it turned out, I had access to them all along. I just didn't realize because the training hadn't been completed. So yeah, that was something that would have been quite nice to have a bit more information on, and a little bit of a clearer UX to get a sense of it. Is there anything else that we want to touch on? I guess one other thing that's worth calling out is, we touched on it very lightly before as well, is the functionality the game offers at a later stage, which feels like base level functionality. So there's a couple of instances where F.I.S.T does this, two in particular that I'm going to call out. The first one is the dash itself. So when you start the game, you have the regular dash, as we talked about, the non-omnidirectional dash, where you only dash in one direction. But more importantly, later on in the game, you unlock this other upgrade called Omnidash Plus, simply put. Is that exactly what it's called? Yeah. An Omnidash Plus. The plus signifies the ability to dash through enemies. So, you know, for example, if you've got an enemy standing here and we were to dash without the upgrade, we would just dash straight into them and be stopped, kind of like dashing into a wall. After you unlock Omnidash Plus, which you unlock quite late into the game, you can dash through them and end up on the opposite side of them. And it feels way more agile and nimble. So, you know, if you're wanting to sort of dodge an attack or move through a combat area, you're not having to sort of jump over enemies all the time. You can just dash right through them and then attack them from different sides. And it felt fantastic. But like I say, it's not something offered straight out of the box when you first start playing, which felt like a strange move to make. Particularly when you really feel the absence of it playing it through for the first time. There was one other thing on top of that. There was the dash. And, that's what it was. So, as we saw earlier, you have the ability to execute enemies after you've dealt enough damage to them, which basically kills them outright, and also does this, which again is something you have to unlock. So, it's this, which is Execution Plus. So, you don't start off with this, and it's quite a cheap upgrade, but again, it felt like something that really sort of like tapped quite well into the execution mechanic. So, any attack that badly damages the enemy has a chance of weakening them. Move next to a weakened enemy and press circle to execute. Executions restore EP. Now, EP is this energy we can see down there in the bottom left next to the carrot juice. So when we do an execution, we get a chunk back. And it created quite a nice, satisfying core game loop in combat, where if you pulled off an execution, you would get an EP back. Executions felt a little bit tacked on, I would say. Like, you know, executions in games like Doom were particularly fantastic because you're sort of taking that risk-reward factor into consideration, where you're thinking to yourself, do I want to get into that position, put myself in that position where it's maybe a little bit more threatening and pull off an execution, but also maybe make myself a bit more vulnerable in turn for the reward. Whereas in F.I.S.T, when you pull off an execution, let's see if we can track that enemy and show one off one more time. When you pull off an execution in F.I.S.T, you're entirely invincible. Like, there's nothing that can hurt you. It's sort of a mini cutscene of sorts that you enter into, during which you're pretty much untouchable, and you can get back EP. Let's just see if we can track one down. We have been here before. Okay, cool. See there we can sort of dash through enemies. I will say that it's VFX, like the attack telegraphing is not too bad, and you know, in sort of more hectic fights can get a little bit more difficult to read. But their attack VFX, I'd say, are particularly well done. Like, it's quite clear to see exactly where you don't want to be standing when an enemy swipes their sword. You can see these really clear, solid blocks of color that actually persist for quite a while even after the enemy is attacked, so you've got a clear sense of what you want to avoid. But let's just see if we can kill one of these things. I don't want to do too much damage. Oh, one more. No, one more. One more. Oh, come on. Okay. But yeah, so it was an interesting thing to sort of like lock what felt like the end of a core loop off behind a progression barrier. Grab that guy as well. I'm at it. Cool, so I think that wraps us up, folks, for our deep dive on F.I.S.T. Forged in the Shadow Torch. Like I say, this has been the second deep dive episode that we've ever done here on GDL, the first one being Doom Eternal, which you can check out on YouTube. If you have enjoyed the episode, then please do give the channel a follow. For future episodes as well, this Wednesday we'd normally do an episode. However, this week we're not going to be due to plans of my own. And next Monday as well, I'll also be unavailable. So next Wednesday will be the next episode we'll be doing here on GDL, where we'll be looking at a deep dive episode on Overwatch, as promised, as a reward for reaching the 50 follower milestone, which I'm hugely looking forward to. I'll be joined by my partner for that one, who will be playing through Overwatch, as they're far better at it than I am. And I'll be chatting through the design of Overwatch, as it's essentially a treasure trove of interesting design choices that I thought would be good to look at together. So that's going to be next Wednesday, same time, same place. So thank you very much again for coming along. Thank you for watching, if you're watching the VOD or watching this on YouTube. Have a great evening or day wherever you are. Thank you again, and good night.